Director, Society for Physical Studies, India. Over to Commodore Uday Bhaskar. He will introduce all the speakers and he will proceed the session. Thank you.
So are we ready with the AV?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Have I switched it on? You can hear me? Yeah. Can you hear me? Hi, morning everyone. My name is Uday Bhaskar. I'm the director for the Society for Policy Studies. I'm also a retired sailor. So in keeping with the maritime flavor of the moment, I'll make a couple of administrative requests if I may. The plot for this morning is that we were supposed to cast off at 0900 and return to harbor as it were at 1030. We are slightly astern. So as people come in, hopefully we'll have the numbers we were seeking. The second related administrative request is please put your phones on silent. And those of you who have new phones and don't know how to put your phone on silent, look right, look left. One of your neighbors might help you. And I'm picking up one little sort of request from yesterday's session, a couple of sessions that we were here. Those of you who have to take emergency calls, either from your headquarters, your Prime Minister's office, or your home, if you think that by cupping your hand you would not be heard, I just want to tell you that you're mistaken. You would be testing the audio skills of your neighbors who would try to tune in to see what you're saying. So my very earnest request is if you have to take a call, please step out of the room. I think that would be appropriate for the protocols of the session. So on that note, before I introduce the speakers, if you see your program, you will notice that there is an audio visual that will be shown first. So if we are ready, Dorai, Prabir, are we ready with the AV? Okay, then we can turn off the lights and please savor the audio visual and then we'll get on to the rest of the session. Thank you.
ASEAN-Indian relationship, a cornerstone of the Act East policy, today has become a driving force in the Asian resurgence. The chronicle of this glorious strategic partnership dates back to the 5th century BC and demonstrates rich cultural and civilization linkages through an oceanic exchange. Old trading routes, architecture, historical artifacts, and finds from India and Southeast Asia are witnesses to the existence of ancient maritime trade relations. With monks, traders, sculptors, and envoys, all traveling for not only an exchange of goods, such as precious metals, textiles, grains, and spices, but also for language, script, art, and culture. Over the 25 years of dialogue partnership, a stronger maritime connectivity between India and ASEAN has flourished, enabling the steady growth of free trade and investments. In 2017-18, the two-way trade in goods between ASEAN and India crossed $80 billion. Signing the ASEAN-India FTA boosted India's trade with ASEAN to reach a peak of about $81 billion in 2017-18 from $53 billion in 2010-11. ASEAN and India are working together for an early conclusion of the Agreement on Maritime Transport and are exploring maritime cargo routes and coastal shipping services between them. At the recently concluded ASEAN-India Commemorative Summit 2018, Indian Prime Minister highlighted the importance that we attach to the subject of ASEAN-India cooperation in the maritime domain. ASEAN-India cooperation in maritime domain is one of the key focus areas for growth and development of the Indo-Pacific region. Today, India is one of the fastest growing major economies in the world. In the last 3 years, Government of India has undertaken a number of initiatives and introduced a series of reforms to improve the business environment in India. As emerging maritime nation, protecting both the economic and security fronts has become critical in order to develop maritime infrastructure. Indian Prime Minister said while opening the International Fleet Review in 2015 at Vizag, India, peaceful and stable maritime environment is critical for the regional and global security. Prime Minister Modi has described our vision in one word: Sagar, or security and growth for all in the region. And thus, through our Act East policy, we endeavor to peacefully utilize the seas with our land and maritime partners to the east. The oceans, lifelines of civilization, are the most important maritime transportation links in the world, providing opportunity, jobs, and prosperity. Over 90% global merchandise trade is carried on the oceans. Oceans are crucial for the global energy security, as over 60% world's oil production moves through sea routes. The magnificent waters carry the untapped potential for worldwide growth. A new thrust to blue economy has encouraged sustainable use of natural resources, harnessing ocean energy, and development of marine biotechnology. PM Modi's Make in India policy and the pioneering Sagar Mala project aim at connecting all coastal cities and ports in India to Southeast Asian regions through road, rail, and air to boost the economic corridors of both coasts. The oceans are prone to security threats like piracy, smuggling, maritime terrorism, natural disasters, illegal fishing, and trafficking of humans and narcotics. ASEAN and India effectively aim to build a security architecture that reinforces maritime cooperation and action through its international structures. At a time of fast-changing geopolitical trends, freedom of navigation proves to be a pivotal challenge in the maritime dimension. Hence, eliminating barriers hindering maritime trade and transport is of an utmost urgency. The ASEAN-India Blue Economy Workshops in 2017 successfully reaffirmed the importance of strengthening maritime cooperation and of promoting peace, security, and freedom of navigation through existing relevant mechanisms, including the expanded ASEAN Maritime Forum, to address maritime challenges. The Blue Economy Workshops laid emphasis on prevention of accidents and quick relay support in search and rescue, encourage constructive collaboration in maritime education and research, cooperate for conservation of marine resources in the Indo-Pacific regions, and address threats obstructing the development of maritime domain. Moreover, promoting potential private sector participation in the development of seaports and maritime network continues to be a high priority area. ASEAN and India are the ideal partners in taking further the agenda of the blue economy. The 10th edition of the Delhi Dialogue looks forward towards discussing the creation of a security architecture in the Indo-Pacific region that will focus on the peaceful settlement of disputes, finding collaborative solutions, and achieving a safe, sustainable, and efficient transport system for strengthening ASEAN-India maritime cooperation.
So there we are, we've had that audio-visual, I think, that has given us a broad overview. On that note, let me formally welcome you to this morning session, which is on maritime cooperation, a new framework for India-ASEAN partnership. Those of you who attended the last session yesterday, the evening session, the plenary, where we were looking at the India-ASEAN in a broader spectrum, the one chaired by Ambassador Sundaram, I think some of those elements segue very well into this morning session, that we are looking at the maritime domain, the Indo-Pacific, in as holistic a manner as is possible. And I just thought I'd set the frame of reference and remind ourselves, if that was necessary, to say that as far as maritime cooperation between India and the ASEAN countries is concerned, this effort has been on for some decades. And I just want to recall that in the early 90s, when we had Prime Minister Narasimha Rao at the helm in India, and India embarked upon the Look East policy, one of the initiatives, many of them were there, but two I wanted to flag, we had the CSCAP meetings. And I'm sure some of the leaders of the delegations here from ASEAN countries may remember that this was a very earnest collective effort, and maritime security was one of the baskets, as we used to call it at that time. And from the early 90s to now, 25 years, I would say that there has been a certain amount of progress, but the issues that have been identified are much the same as they should be, that there is a certain continuity. And whether yesterday, I think we had one of our Malaysian representatives giving us the 3D formulation, suggesting that we could look at the maritime domain and cooperation under the 3 Ds, which is for defense, for development, and diplomacy, and how it could be pursued or taken forward in terms of its policy relevance. In earlier sessions, those of you who were in Bhubaneswar, where again under the aegis of the RIS, we had the academic and the professionals, meeting. We also tried to triangulate maritime cooperation across 3 strands, saying that there is the equivalent of a geostrategic compulsion. States are very sensitive about their security priorities. The geo-economic, the trade, energy, and that whole cluster of activities that we bring under the geo-economic. And the third was a suggestion that there is a geophysical dimension that looks at the well-being and the health of the oceans, in as much as it tries to address the health and well-being of the community, the coastal community, the coastal state, the littoral state, and this whole blue economy, the blue growth. So whichever way you look at it, I think the scope for maritime cooperation, and that is the broad frame of reference where this morning we have a very eminent panel, and I hope that we would be able to take forward what has been said in the past over the last 20 years, 20 plus years, and that from each, I think this is the effort of the Delhi dialogue, that we are able to identify the low-hanging fruit which are politically acceptable when you go back to your respective headquarters and your ministries or your departments, that hopefully this dialogue would allow us to identify as a group those takeaways that could be translated into action points, bullets for implementation before we meet again under the banner of the next dialogue or whatever, whichever country has. There are so many initiatives that are going on. And when I was looking at these slides and the visuals, I was also reminded of, again, those of you who remember, we had the Milan initiative, which is again the early 90s. And it brought together some of the ASEAN countries at that time to Port Blair. And we embarked on something. When I say we, I'm talking about almost this entire Indian audience here who have been differently associated with this effort. So from the Look East to what Prime Minister Modi now talks about as Sagar, in his first year when he assumed office, he actually advocated this particular security and growth for all in the region. And you can see a certain policy evolution from 2014 to the last iteration, whether it was the India-Indonesia bilateral or the India-ASEAN summit. The focus now on ASEAN as a collective and what India and ASEAN can do together. And again, the maritime domain in its most holistic spectrum lends itself as perhaps the most doable domain. So that's the broad frame. I thought that I would flag that. And for this morning. I'm very happy and glad to introduce in our midst Vice Admiral Ashok Kumar. He is currently the Deputy Chief for the Naval Staff, and he would make the special address this morning. And for those of you who know the subtext of Delhi, to have a serving Deputy Chief from the Indian Navy in our midst, is itself, I think, indicative of the way in which this is being approached in terms of the relevance of this engagement under the Delhi dialogue. Admiral Ashok Kumar is someone I've known for many years. We were colleagues in the Navy at one time. I retired. He served in Singapore as the defense advisor, and subsequently he's held a number of appointments. I won't go into the detail that's available. And I'll request him to, sir, would you like to speak from here or there? Or, yeah, all yours.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. Kamara Dean, co-panelists, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed my privilege to be here to kickstart this session on the ASEAN-India maritime cooperation section of this whole dialogue. I must at the outset confess that this audio-visual which was shown and Commodore Uday Bhaskar's introductory remarks, I think have stolen the thunder out of my script. But it was by and large what I wanted to say that the audio-visual covered. Having said that, my 3 years in Singapore is one of the most fondly remembered by me, and my involvement with ASEAN in general, because as DA Singapore I was also accredited to Philippines. And quite interestingly, in those 3 years that I was there, a couple of years, the ASEAN summit, 1 year was in Singapore and the other it was at Cebu in Philippines, and which I was a part of. So one tends to realize how there are tremendous historical and civilizational linkages between India and ASEAN. As it was brought out, the relationship goes back to millennia, to 500 BC, as it was pointed out in the presentation. But historically and universally, you will always find that flag has always followed trade. And the element of maritime security is always involved with trade links that have existed between nation states historically. So you will remember as to how Rajaraja Chola in the end 9th century was dealing with trade with ASEAN nations. And very quickly, when Rajendra Chola was in power, there was also a naval expedition which went down to the ASEAN region. For whatever reasons, I'll not go back into history for that. So this is a historical truth that maritime security would always be an essential part of whatever we want to do. Today, there is this tremendous drive for cooperation and connectivity in commerce and so on and so forth. But none of which would be possible without ensuring security. And in our state, because we are maritime neighbors, India and ASEAN, maritime security plays a very key component. So in the 10 odd minutes that I have, I will touch upon certain imperatives, what I think are the threats, the current cooperation mechanisms, and what I think the future holds insofar as maritime security is concerned. Let me briefly touch upon IOR. You all are aware of the strategic importance of the Indian Ocean region. Alfred Thayer Mahan at the turn of the 20th century said that the destiny of the world will be determined in the waters of Indian Ocean in the 21st century. Now, in fact, there is a question mark whether he actually said it or not. But if he had actually said it, it was quite prophetic, because that's exactly what is happening. As again, the statistics that was indicated in the audio visual, large amount of trade today passes through the waters of Indian Ocean. And interestingly, 80% of the trade that Indian Ocean deals with is actually external to the Indian Ocean, unlike the Antarctic or the Pacific Ocean. It's only 20% which is internal to the Indian Ocean. And therefore, the critical importance of choke points that provide egress into or egress out of the Indian Ocean. And out of all these choke points, I think those which cut through ASEAN, whether it is Malacca Straits, whether it is the Sunda Strait, whether it is the Lombok or the Ombai Weta as a part of Indonesia, and Malacca with 3 littorals, Malaysia, Indonesia and Singapore, form a critical key choke points. Because you, I'm sure, know the statistics more than I do. In 2016, there were over 83,000 ships that went through Malacca Straits. So any disturbance or any maritime security threat to the safe passage of this trade to these straits would have huge impacts, huge adverse impacts on world economy. So that is the importance that India attaches to this. Now, the other thing that I want to mention is that you will also realize that the Indo-Pacific, the connection between the Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean is through the ASEAN. And so the importance of Malacca Strait was, if you all recall, Hu Jintao as President of China in 2003 mentioned about the Malacca dilemma. And there was an overdrive to address this issue and come out with alternatives. So you find a whole lot of pipeline infrastructure, road infrastructure for oil and gas and cargo. The interesting part is that most of that also passes through ASEAN. Whether you talk about the Shafu Kunming pipeline or the Isthmus of Kra Canal, even when it were to come up, all cut through the ASEAN. And yet, the reality is this: the cost of transportation of oil or gas through pipelines and of cargo through road transportation will always be much costlier than the cost of transportation overseas. So sea will always remain the preferred option for trade. Therefore, this 83,000 ships that I mentioned about through Malacca Straits is only bound to increase with time. I don't see any scope of these numbers reducing in the future at all, thereby the critical importance. Having said this, let me briefly touch upon what threats are. Again, this is again brought out beautifully in the audio visual that we saw. We've got maritime terrorism, piracy. The number of piracy incidents, the reason because of which RECAP was instituted over above the International Piracy Reporting Center at Kuala Lumpur, with RECAP ISC being set up at Singapore. We have gun running, arms smuggling, drug peddling, IUU fishing, and also natural calamities. If you take your mind back to 2004 December tsunami, Indian Navy was fully involved in whatever had to be the follow-up of the tsunami of the 24th of December 2004. So the crux of it is that it is extremely important for the maritime security dimension to be in place between the two organizations, whether it is India or ASEAN, so that the other projects can move on smoothly. Let me now move on to what I am here for, which is what are the collaborative efforts between India and ASEAN. As rightly brought out by Kamara Dean, we started the Milan series of exercise in 1992. And interestingly, 1992 was the year when the Look East policy came into being. It was the 1990 economic liberalization under Narasimha Rao, which actually opened up the India-ASEAN relationship. And the relationship upgradation to strategic partnership in 2012 was nothing but a natural progression of our sectoral partnership in 1992, going up to dialogue partner in 1996, and to a summit level partner in 2002. And of course, under the present Prime Minister, Honorable Shri Narendra Modi, we have also taken Look East policy one step further by redesignating it as Act East policy. And there is considerable amount of progress which has been made on that front too. India has been a member of the ARF since 1996. And in every event that is organized by the ARF, the ADMM Plus, India is a part of. We also have in place numerous defense cooperation agreements, defense policy dialogues, Navy-to-Navy staff talks, maritime security dialogues, and many such other meetings between the Indian Navy and the navies of ASEAN, most of them bilateral in nature. We have IONS, as was brought out. In 2008, Indian Navy launched the first collaborative maritime initiative of the world of the 21st century. This was in 2008. And out of the ASEAN nations, 5 of them whose shores are washed by the Indian Ocean are members of the IONS. And out of these 5, 4 countries are also part of the IONS working group on different specializations, whether it is HADR, whether it is information exchange, whether it is maritime security, and so on and so forth. We now are headed towards the 10th anniversary of IONS this November, which is being celebrated at Cochin, and it is expected that all the chiefs of navies from these 5 IONS nations would be at Cochin. Milan series of exercise, which I mentioned, 6 of the 10 navies participated in the Milan series of exercise this year in 2018, March 2018. And for the first ever time, we also upgraded Milan to include Milan's sea exercise at sea, which is called MILES. So one of the first multilateral maritime exercises at sea which the Indian Navy held. And 6 of the 10 ASEAN nations, in fact only 9 of them have navies, one of them is a landlocked country. So 6 of 9 ASEAN navies did participate in that. There are numerous other things. We have got corpats with 3 countries with whom we share international maritime boundary lines. We have got bilateral exercises. And these bilateral exercises have been on for a very long time. With Singapore, for example, this year we celebrate the 25th anniversary of SIMBEX, which is a Singapore-India maritime bilateral exercise. This year, we started the inaugural edition of bilats with 3 different countries. Myanmar, we started with Vietnam, and we are soon to start with Indonesia as well. We've got white shipping technical agreements signed with a number of countries of the region, with ASEAN. I really think this is one of the most important things because I'll cover that in my future plans for security as well. And we've also helped a number of nations set up their CSRS chains, coastal surveillance radar systems. We have numerous PASEXs, port visits, training at each other's mutual naval training institutions, etc. We also have now a revised concept of mission-based deployments. The Indian Navy, since last year, has gone on to mission-based deployments. In these waters towards ASEAN, we have got 2 deployments. One of them is the NORDEP, which is in the northern Bay of Bengal, and the other one being MALDEP, which is we call it the Malacca deployment, although we remain out of the waters of the littorals towards the 6-degree channel, exiting out of Malacca to the west. And it is giving us tremendous benefits. Not only is our presence being felt there, we also react to any developing situations. A classic example of Cyclone Mora, which hit Myanmar last year. The Indian naval ship which was deployed there literally followed the cyclone into Myanmar and to Bangladesh to provide instant relief. And HADR missions were undertaken. Similarly, these ships are available for any foreign cooperation initiatives with any of the littoral navies. Whether it is sea riders, whether it is PASEXs, whether it is any other type of exercise, port visits, etc. We are happy to take them on. We also have a couple of logistics agreements in place with a couple of countries. That helps us undertake operational turnarounds. You are aware as to how one of the NOPVs deployed for MALDEP recently undertook an OTR at Sabang. Similarly, one of our ships undertook an OTR at Singapore during the Shangri-La dialogue when Prime Minister Modi was in Singapore at that time. We are already members, as you are aware, of the RECAP organization, the Regional Agreement to Combat Piracy. And we do have an officer who is on deputation to the RECAP Information Sharing Center at Singapore. We also have an officer posted at the Information Fusion Center at the Changi C2 Center in Singapore. So there are a wide variety of mechanisms in place through which we collaborate with ASEAN, both bilateral and multilateral. So let me just sum it up by saying what do we look for? What is there in the agenda for the future? Our intention is to continue to enhance both bilateral and multilateral engagements with each of the ASEAN navies, collectively or individually. Similarly, as I mentioned, the white shipping TA and information exchange, I really think is critical to maritime security. We ourselves have an aim of creating an information fusion center at Delhi here with international liaison officers, either physically or virtually, as it's convenient to the countries, and ASEAN will be one of our favored nations for invites. Operations from each other's naval facilities. We are quite open to any ship visit to any of our harbors at any given time. And so visit to each other's port facilities is something that we'll continue to enhance. This also enhances our ability to remain deployed at farther places from the Indian coastline. Cross-attachment of personnel and also enhancing interoperability is something that we'll continue to look for. We need to continue to enhance the scope and complexity of the bilateral exercises and the multilateral exercises. Of course, that depends upon the comfort levels of each of the navies in the ASEAN. Training has been truly a strength of the Indian Navy. And not only do we offer additional training vacancies to ASEAN, but the aim is also to depute mobile training teams. There are a number of countries to which we depute mobile training teams to undertake customized training for those countries. And this we intend to enhance. We also have a vibrant flag officer sea training organization when it comes to combat workup of ships. This has been on offer to all the navies, and there are a number of navies which actually utilize the FOST workup capability to enhance their maritime competence. Of course, there are other areas like shipbuilding for capacity building of their own navies. We've got a vibrant defense R&D, etc. I mean, these are areas in which we look to collaborate. Hydrography, a strength of the Indian Navy. Similarly, meteorology. We now have a project Panorama, which is a 3D visualization of weather over the sea, which we are willing to share with every ASEAN nation. So this is what I truly think the future holds in so far as collaboration is concerned. Finally, let me conclude. I would like to state that today, any maritime security threat that stares us in the face is by and large transnational in nature. And as a result, it cannot be individual countries attempting to provide solutions. The solutions will always be multinational in its construct and its character. And therefore, it is not only important, but I really think it is inevitable for us to collaborate in the field of maritime security. Thank you very much.
A very comprehensive overview from Admiral Kumar about the scope of the maritime security cooperation and what's going on just now. Time permitting, we'll try and discuss some of these in the last part of the session. On that note, allow me now to invite our first panelist this morning. There's a slight rearrangement of the order of the speakers. And I've been getting some signals and messages from the organizers. So I'm making an unreasonable request, but very earnestly to the panelists, that from the original 10, now I'm requesting them to make their remarks in 8 minutes. And this is unfair, I apologize, but it's the nature of the beast that, when we have such a rich panel. So one request is don't read your papers, make your points, and hopefully we'll take it up in the QA if you have the time. I'll invite Captain Parmar first. He used to be a colleague of mine both at the National Maritime Foundation and the IDSA. And he has an amazing time management skill, which he is going to now demonstrate. Sarabjit, I'm not introducing him. His CV is there in the booklet. Very distinguished sailor, if I may say so. Sarabjit, all yours.
Thank you, Chair. Could I have my presentation on, please? I was going to barter with you, sir, for a minute extra and cooperation, but since Admiral Ashok Kumar has covered a lot of my points, I think time management is in the air and we can somehow manage it. Okay. How do I operate this? Some help on this? How do I operate? Okay. What I'm going to do is, I'm going to do a little bit of theory initially. I believe it's good for the soul. And I fully understood the impact of Bernoulli's theorem only when I started flying. So when you look at regional arrangements and maritime environments, it's necessary to look a little bit of theory. And thereafter, I will look at the maritime environment of India, ASEAN, and perhaps lay out a template for possible cooperation. Let me take you to what Barry Buzan and Ole Weaver made after the Cold War was over, and they divided the world into 9 regional security complexes and 2 proto-complexes. I'd like you to look at the right top where you see the Asian super-complex, and that's where I'm going to focus on a little later. But having said that, what is it that RSCT tells us about evaluations? First of all, it enables an understanding of the security order in the particular region. it also gives an evaluation of the relative balance of power. But as far as India and ASEAN is concerned, it's at this point that we need to look at mutual relationship within the region and also between regionalizing and globalizing trends. And that is something we need to focus on, because globalization has actually shrunk the world. So what is it that regional security complexes are defined by or delineated by? One is they are defined by durable patterns of amity and enmity. They are characterized by historical factors or the common cultural embrace of a civilizational area, derived from the interplay between the existing order and its balance of power consequences. And lastly, generation of security interdependence due to physical proximity. Now this is important, is that although the seas may cross over from the Bay of Bengal to the South China Sea, from India to the last nation of ASEAN, the more the distant you are, the more you need to work towards looking at security interdependence. Proximity is the key, and we need to bridge that gap. So when you look at, say, the Indo-Pacific per se, you have the South African region security complex, you have the Horn proto-complex, and a proto-complex has got sufficient security independence to delineate a region, but it has weak regional dynamics to qualify as a full-fledged RSC. Perhaps down the years, the Horn proto-complex will also become an RSC. Then you have the Middle East, you have the South Asian, and you have the East Asian. Now the South Asian and the East Asian regional security complexes combine together to form what is called the Asian supercomplex. And this, to my mind, is what defines also the Indo-Pacific. But within this region itself, we have India and ASEAN. And when you look at the dividing line, it actually is the border between India and Myanmar, and comes down delineating, keeping the Andaman Nicobar Islands within the South Asian RSC. The Malacca Strait comes into the East Asian RSC, and it comes down towards Australia. Now this is not a very clear-cut divide. Neither has it been, neither will it be, for the simple reason that we have been able to have convergence factors between India and ASEAN. First of all, as has been said, we have Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, both members of IORA and ASEAN. Myanmar, a Bay of Bengal nation, and also an ASEAN member. To my mind, Myanmar, Thailand, and Indonesia are also, in a way, South Asian nations. So therefore, this is the common factor when we cross over from that imaginary dividing line. ASEAN and India has got historical and cultural linkages. A lot of has been said yesterday. More importantly is India's look and act east policies that have managed to bridge this gap and the interplay between India and ASEAN. Now I do a free fall from the political level, and I'll come down to the grassroots of the operational strategic level, where I invoke the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, and my slide needs correction here. Malaysia, which was earlier an observer, is now a full-fledged member in the April ION Symposium held in Iran. Therefore, you've got 5 members of ION. That's 50% of ASEAN already there. So you already have 50% of ASEAN looking this side, and we have India already looking that side. So these are the convergence factors that have worked in the favor of India-ASEAN relations. Now, if you look at the maritime environment, and if I look at only, say, the Bay of Bengal, crossing down across the Malacca Straits, Lombok, Sunda, and up to the South China Sea, this is the crucible of the Indo-Pacific. This is where the heart of the Indo-Pacific lies. So what is the maritime environment? Let's take it that it's a multi-dimensional space with seamless connectivity with other environments, and therefore it is subject to insecurity and instability, which is inflected via non-traditional threats. And to my mind, non-traditional threats are going to be the cornerstone of India-ASEAN maritime cooperation. That is something that is acceptable to everybody on a benign level and at an operational level to tackle. So what is the solution? And I'm going to take a page here from the Indian Maritime Security Strategy document of 2015, the third strategy to shape a favorable and positive maritime environment. And therefore, the solution is to shape a favorable and positive maritime environment within our areas of interest. What do I mean by favorable and positive? Keep existing threats at low level and contain or prevent any rise in threats. And this requires a lot of understanding at the political level, so it translates to the ease of business and cooperation. So if you've understood the complexities of the maritime environment as far as India-ASEAN is concerned, let's move on to maritime cooperation. And I will step it up a notch here, where I say that there are 3 aims that are required if you want to look at maritime cooperation. And first is preservation of peace, promotion of stability, and maintenance of security. No nation can do it alone. We need to cooperate. This would be in line of the January 28 declaration. This is one paragraph that caught my mind, and also in line with the Shangri-La statement of our Prime Minister of a free, open, inclusive Indo-Pacific. Therefore, the nature of non-traditional threats, we need to look at constructive engagement, which enables understanding of threats and challenges, and more importantly, at the operation level, an understanding of rules of engagement if you're going to go against piracy and terrorism. This definitely both together will improve interoperability. Certain steps that can be taken is presence and rapid response, engagements, capacity building, capability enhancement, develop regional MDA and maritime security operations. A lot has been covered by the Deputy Chief. I will not go into details, but the point to note here is the cooperation needs to have constructive engagement, and this is a two-way channel. These have already been covered, so I'll just go through it, but in the exercises point, I think we need to institutionalize an India-ASEAN exercise. Maybe at the level of Milan, maybe at a lower level, or maybe we can hype it up to the Malabar series also. That can be examined. Therefore, certain maritime security operations that we can look at are EZ surveillance patrols, anti-piracy, HADR, non-combatant evacuation, maritime interdiction operations, suspicious vessels for all maritime crimes which we can agree upon, including IUU, gun running, trafficking, what all we have. Peace support operations. We must also remember that the UN Charter also supports regional efforts towards ensuring peace and stability in your area. And I leave you with this table here, which is indicative from May 2016 to June 2018, the maritime interactions between the Indian Navy and the navies of various nations, and you will find a list of 8 of them here. All 10 if you include the ASEAN 50th anniversary. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarabjit, and I apologize again because I think you had a lot to share, but hopefully in the QA we can take it. In the interest of time, I'll call upon the next speaker. Dr. Kamara Dean is the DDG in the Department of Maritime Affairs in Malaysia. She has a terrific CV. I'll leave it at that and request you, madam, to also stay within that bandwidth of 8 to 9 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Salam and good morning. The pressure is on me as a civilian to keep up with the men in uniform with their time management. Okay, so I'll go very direct. First, I would like to say that it's indeed pertinent to be here, and I'm very personally happy to be here at the 10th Delhi Dialogue. It is a decade after you started, so I'm coming in for the first time, but looking at how it has progressed a decade, why is a decade of evolution to the approaches on maritime and security and Indo-Pacific and maritime domain issues. It was also timely and good for me because the first 2 sessions yesterday was on the Northeast and the Act East policy of India. Very enlightening. So right now, I would like to go direct to the maritime cooperation theme of today, which is not new, actually. But I must say the Delhi Declaration have actually enhanced it further and underlined the focus to go forward. Now, why do I say it's not new? But it's a matter of us now at the stage of enhancing and strengthening the cooperation. Actually, India and ASEAN have, as 2 speakers, our learned speakers have elaborated, we have started a lot of cooperation. I would like to touch on that. There's 3 East Asia Conference Summit, EAS, on International Conference on Maritime Security and Cooperation that have been held in India on these issues, and there was also an ARF workshop on best practices in implementing safety of navigation instrument with the Philippines in July 2017. So there are already some cooperation, but being a littoral state, littoral countries of Bay and Bengal and the Indian Ocean region, India and ASEAN member countries are vulnerable to common challenges, especially those emanating from the oceans, natural disaster, human trafficking, narcotics, gun running, maritime piracy. While India and ASEAN have been working together to meet these challenges, maybe perhaps the next stage, a more coordinated efforts will be needed as the both sides move forward. Now, I would like to touch on maritime security again. there is actually, being a legal person, I must go back to the definition or legal definition. There is no set definition of what maritime security is. In its 2008 Oceans and Law of the Sea report, the UN General Assembly noted that it encompasses a wide range of threats. And at its narrowest conception, it's actually a direct threat, sometimes to the integrity of the state, such an armed attack from a military vessel, but it includes other intentional unlawful damage to the maritime environment, as well from illegal dumping, discharge of pollutant from sea, and depletion of natural resources. So in this vein, the ARF Work Plan for Maritime Security 2015-2017 have divided these threats into two broad categories, and it includes military threats and state sovereignty concern, non-traditional security threats, and the work plan regards the latter as useful early building blocks to cultivate trust and consensus in the region. Malaysia is a littoral state, and we have worked with our other littoral states in order to safeguard the safety of navigation, the safety of the Straits of Malacca from threats, and it is done in a physical way, from regular patrols and monitoring conducted throughout the Malaysian maritime area, through electronic, from having eye in the sky or electronic capabilities, through cooperation with other littoral states, and also through other cooperative mechanism, the Malacca Straits Patrol, cooperative mechanism between littoral states and the users of the straits. Now, let me go forward to the new stage of enhancement. We have heard a lot about maritime security, and I agree with our men in uniform and also civilian that this is a very important issue. But there must be also some area of safety or element of safety that we also need to discuss and further cooperate. Yesterday, the first day during the Blue Economic Workshop, I had an opportunity to discuss on maritime safety with, I think he's here, if I'm not mistaken, DIG Vargas from National Maritime Institute or Foundation of India. And he has also pertinently brought forward the issue of, as we talk about increased trade and commerce and maritime connectivity, where there are more ships plying the sea, we must also talk about safety of ports, of pollutions, of pollutant, perhaps from the pain from the sea, and also the coastal communities surrounding, the sea. And maritime connectivity will somehow have the implication. So it must go in a very holistic approach. It can't be you just want to increase trades, which is very good, but let's also see some cooperation to mitigate the factor or the implication of such increase in trade. I would also like to say that perhaps maritime safety has these issues of aids to navigation as they go through the treacherous water and marine pollution. Next, I would like to look at the Blue Economy Framework itself. The Blue Economy Framework that I attended 2 days before was indeed an eye-opener. We have moved from the first one in Vietnam to going through further discussion. And what is very, very interesting for me was the use of technology in aid of blue economy, looking at remote sensing, space technology, and also from the submarine, the mapping of the ocean seabed. I really like to say that I was very enlightened by the way India's approach, for example, how you harvest from the sea, but you reconcile it with taking care of the ocean health. So that is the Blue Economy Framework is another way to go forward. A final point, ascertaining the stakeholders in maritime cooperation, identifying actual training and capacity building, perhaps in law enforcement, and also my learned colleague has said information sharing. So, and I think maritime cooperation is not just on operational value, but on the knowledge value. Yesterday I heard someone, I think it was a minister or not, but he was very philanthropic in his approach. So perhaps some exposure to what are maritime security issues and public international law, the legal instruments, basically on knowledge base. Because I think, coming back to I was an Ayurvedic patient, so it's not just you address the symptom, you look at the holistic approach. So knowledge is an important element. So training is not just on capacity building in operational, but also in knowledge. So ladies and gentlemen, to cap it all, to encapsulate, we believe that maritime cooperation is increasingly important. And now it's a time for India and ASEAN. So in this connection, we support the idea of enhancing the cooperation in the maritime domain as one of our key elements of ASEAN-India strategic partnership. Also, ASEAN and India must, I think, need to clarify activities to be pursued under this cooperation in order to avoid duplication of activities under the various ASEAN-led mechanisms. And we can cooperate using some of the current ASEAN mechanisms in this area, EAS, ARF, and EAMF. With that, I thank you, and I hope I score some points. Thank you.
You score a very elegant 9 on 9 for your, time compliance, if I may say so. But I want to thank Dr. Kamara Dean actually for flagging some very important points. She made reference to the health of the ocean. Now, this is something that is being flagged in more recent deliberations that we have had. And I do know that this is one area where we can look at the equivalent of all stakeholders contributing to understanding the nature of the problem. We are in a mess. When I say we, I'm saying the global collective is in a mess in relation to the health of the oceans. I won't go into the detail, but thank you, madam, for flagging it, and we can talk about it. Let me introduce Professor Shankari Sundaram. She's already there. She knows exactly our timelines. But as one of the more distinguished academics, in this domain, we've had a number of very illustrious academics who have been contributing to this particular ASEAN, India, Look East, etc. And I thought I'd just take a moment to also recall two of our lady professors, academics in the early years. We had Professor Carolina Hernandez from Philippines. Do we have any reps from Philippines? You may remember her. She used to be with us in the CSCAP. And Professor Kusuma from Thailand. Sitwangse. She's also, as I said, someone who's made an enormous contribution. So I thought I should flag the contribution being made by women academics. On that note, Shankari, you and your time compliance are on test.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you to the organizers. I'm going to cut short the formalities in light of the fact that we have about 8 to 9 minutes left. So my sincere thanks to the organizers for asking me to be part of this. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start my presentation. I think this theme is going to be very critical because this is the same theme that this panel actually focuses on, the theme of the conference, which is on India-ASEAN maritime cooperation. My presentation this morning is actually divided into 3 sections. The first section, I will look at the significance of the Indo-Pacific in terms of the definitional context itself. And what I want to say is that the Indo-Pacific, while there is a lot of ambiguity on what this definition actually means, I think what what we must understand is that it is not just a semantic shift, but it's actually important in how we are looking at the transitions shaping the region. And moreover, I think what it means is that there is a perceptual change on how we are viewing the geopolitics of the region. And the Indo-Pacific, in that sense, redefines the region as it existed historically. Because if you look at the Act East policy itself and the reiteration to what is called the 3 Cs, or the commerce, culture, and connectivity, historically prior to colonialism, you actually see that the patterns of historical exchanges actually existed along lines of commerce, along the lines of culture, and the strategic linkages through connectivity, both through the land as well as the maritime space, actually had a robust interaction between these areas. If at all this area came under any shift, I think the fact that the colonial period, 200 years, the Bay of Bengal, the Andaman Sea, and the Malacca Strait, which was actually one strategic unit, 200 years, this was divided both vertically as well as horizontally. Horizontally, the Bay of Bengal was divided by the British and the Dutch during the Anglo-Dutch Agreement of 1824, or what is called the Straits Settlement, where you divided the Malacca Straits into the northern and the southern portions, with the British expanding northwards and the Dutch expanding southwards. Significantly, post-colonial era, you saw the division of the same region vertically with the landmass where you became subunits of South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and this also impacted the maritime domain where subunits were created. So if you look at the Indo-Pacific as a single strategic unit, I think it becomes very relevant to understand our maritime security from that point. And it's interesting because this is not just to be viewed in terms of a linear understanding, in terms of whether it's due to the rise of China or whether it's due to the rise of India. But I think what is more important is that this understanding comes from the fact that all the countries of this region were dependent on this single strategic maritime extent for both the travel of its commerce as well as for the exchange of cultural ideas. So in that sense, the Indo-Pacific is redefined and it needs to be looked at as the new geopolitical reality. The second part of my paper actually looks at how India's Act East policy resonates specifically with impact on the maritime cooperation. In 2014, when it was rechristened as the Act East policy, the Look East policy was rechristened as Act East policy, I think one of the determinants that became very clear was that there would be a continued focus on India's extended neighborhood. And in that sense, I see three general areas of similarity complementarity, I would say, between the Look East and the Act East policy. And I also see 3 or 4 specific areas where the maritime domain becomes relevant. The first of the general areas is that the Indo-Pacific region remains as one of the priorities for Indian diplomatic priority. The second is that if you look at the earlier avatar of the Look East policy and the Act East policy, what you see is that there has been a clear emphasis on the adherence to an ASEAN-led regionalism, and the centrality of ASEAN has remained very, very critical from India's point of view. The third general reality that I see is that when you look at the Act East policy, it extends not beyond the geographical limits of ASEAN member states. And this is very critical because you see this as early as the second decade of the Look East policy. And in the third decade of the Look East policy, this is becoming even more relevant. In terms of the specific areas where I look at the maritime domain and where the Act East policy resonates into the maritime domain, I think from almost November 2015 onwards, you see this a lot of emphasis being given by India in its pronouncements publicly at the diplomatic level on the importance of the maritime domain. And here I want to focus on a few things. That one of the first indicators that I see is that India began to contribute towards regional peace and security by repeatedly emphasizing the importance of the global commons. And here I look but particularly at the case of the maritime initiative. And here what you see is the question of the global commons, maritime security related to freedom of navigation. This became a part of India's pronouncements at all the international forums. The second indicator, to my mind, is that when you see the official pronouncements that India has made, specifically with relation both to the Indian Ocean as well as to the South China Sea, what you see is that India has constantly spoken at the bilateral as well as at the multilateral level about the rules-based order, the need to respect the United Nations Convention on Law of the Seas, and what you see is there is a repeated reference, especially in the context of the South China Sea, to pushing the conclusion for the Code of Conduct. And it's interesting that even after the ruling from the Permanent Court of Arbitration, India's entire focus was to say that there must be utmost respect for the law of the seas and that the law of the seas will become critical to India. So in not just India, but to the regional players. So I think what you see in the shift that you see that India has been making is that, in the early stages of the Look East policy, India sort of remained a kind of an observer to the Asian multilateralism and was sort of getting, socialized into the patterns of this multilateralism. However, more recently, what you see is that it has had a much more conservative approach to the balance of power and has also been talking about the importance of maintaining the security of the wider Indo-Pacific region. I think much has been said about the Indian Ocean, both by Vice Admiral Kumar as well as Captain Parmar. So I'm not going to go go into very many details on the Indian Ocean, except to say that the outreach, the maritime outreach under the Indian Act East policy has been seen in two different areas. And if you see the maritime strategy paper that has come out, it identifies the Indian Ocean as the primary area of our interest, and it identifies the Western Pacific as a secondary area of India's interest. And the question of the third part of my presentation, I think I have about 2 minutes left, which will look at just simply the challenges and options for India. I think identifying, first challenge to my mind, I'll just flag these as points. The first challenge to my mind is that identifying areas of convergence between the ASEAN states, especially on what constitutes the different views of various countries on what is the Indo-Pacific. The question of freedom of navigation, how different countries view freedom of navigation itself. All this, in order to bring these ideas into convergence itself, is one of the first challenge. The second thing is that when you look at the second challenge, which I'll identify, is what is called the geopolitics of infrastructure. With the entire move by the Chinese to create both the continental and the maritime kind of outreach through the BRI and the MSR, I think states are under compulsion to allow infrastructure development within their space, and as a result of it, what is happening to states is both the debt trap as well as the strategic autonomy question. So this is going to be a critical factor for us to watch. The second, I think the third point is that does the Indo-Pacific order have any one structural unit that will sort of, drive the debate on maritime security? I think what you see is there is an existence of several frameworks and several orders existing simultaneously. You have the bilateral, you have the trilaterals, you have the quadrilateral, you have the 18-member EAS, you have the ADMM+, you have multiple of these orders existing simultaneously. So I think it will be important for us to identify as India and ASEAN together as to what will be the defining order that is going to be the structural format for this region. And finally, in terms of a rule-based order, how do you then deal with states that do not believe in following the, the UNCLOS or the pronouncements that come from, say, the arbitration, court of arbitration? So these are the critical points where, in terms of how do you face these challenges, I think there are about 5 of them. The options for India, finally, in conclusion, is that India is actually seen as a normative player, and I think there is a convergence of India and ASEAN focus in terms of core maintenance of the normative order, and I think this is where it's important for us to focus repeatedly on the, speech made by Prime Minister Modi at the Shangri-La dialogue, where his reference has been to a free, the open, the inclusive, and the rules-based order. And if you look at it individually with countries like Vietnam as well as with Indonesia, I think this was flagged in the opening remarks by Commodore Bhaskar, that individually when you look at bilaterally, we have been able to come to some kind of an understanding on what are these convergences. However, if you take the entire ASEAN region as a whole, I think the complexity is that ASEAN is 10 members, 10 priorities, 10 security agendas, so all this has to be factored in terms of how we approach this common space. The focus, in conclusion, I think the focus for India will continue to remain on the relevance of ASEAN centrality, while there will continue to be a nuanced approach to regional power plays, which will be factored in the wider Indo-Pacific. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shankari. I think there are lots of points there for discussion. I hope we'll have the time. But one observation, India sees itself as a normative player. That was the sign-off by Shankari in her last section of her remarks. It'll be interesting either in this session or later to do a reality check and see whether our ASEAN members have a similar kind of perception about India as a normative player. I think it'll help us to get a better sense about where we are headed if we are talking about a collective effort. But we'll come back to that later. On that note, allow me to welcome and introduce Mr. Rushdie. He is the founder director of the National Maritime Institute in Indonesia. Has a great profile in journalism, done various things, and it's all there in the CV, by the way. And maybe, have a longer chat. Mr. Rushdie, all yours, 8 minutes. Go, sir.
I'll be faster than that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, distinguished guests. This is very technical, I think, so this will be fast. If we talk about maritime connectivity between India and ASEAN, actually we talk about shipping business. So what kind of shipping type we will use in this connectivity? Ro-ro vessel, passenger, or cargo vessel? We have a case between Indonesia and the Philippines. Our President Jokowi and President Duterte inaugurated Davao Bitung Ro-ro vessel just a year ago. But now the service is already stopped because we don't have enough calculation about what is this business actually. We're talking about connectivity, connectivity, and connectivity. So for me, we need more than discussion about connectivity. We need to go deeper, deeper, and deeper to calculate the opportunity between India, ASEAN maritime connectivity. Maritime connectivity is something different with other connectivity because maritime is very unique reality. You cannot put your vessel without calculating whether they are cargo or not. So we have to know whether let's say in Sabang, in Indonesia, we have enough cargo to transport to maybe Port Blair in Andaman or Nicobar, or maybe from Penang to Medan or to Belauan, to Dumai. So again, we have to calculate cargo as a main driving force of our maritime connectivity. And then we also must discuss about whether we will move people or we will move cargo. Because in the lakes of Batam and Singapore, there's a ferry service. That's very good business. Every day, hundreds of Indonesians and Singaporeans back and forth from Batam to Singapore or Singapore to Batam. So we have to discuss more about moving of people or moving of goods. And then we also must discuss whether this service should be conducted by national flag carrier or independent business player. You see, in ASEAN, we don't have, in Indonesia, for example, we don't have a national flag carrier anymore. We have, previously we have Jakarta Lloyd, but now it's diminished, stop on and only operating within domestic service. Singapore and OL also diminishing, already by French shipping line, CMA, CGM. So whether it can be conducted by national flag carrier or other independent player, we also must discuss this to realize, to materialize our maritime connectivity between India and ASEAN or between bilateral countries like India and Indonesia, in Sabang or in West Sumatra, port of Belauan, port of Teluk Bayur. And then shipping business is private intensive. We cannot put our national budget, our national shipping lines to highly operate here, because shipping is a private business and already striving for years, 100 years. So we have to give more room for this private involvement in connecting our region, India and ASEAN. I think that's my point. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your remarks about relevance of shipping. On that note, allow me to introduce Dr. Chung Chien One. He is currently heading the ASEAN part of the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore. We met in earlier conferences, and his USP is he's perhaps the only PhD scholar, University of Arizona. They award PhDs in the saddle. I don't know of any other university that gives you a PhD when you're on a horseback, but sir, on that note, welcome and please make your remarks. You can gallop away.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Please allow me to convey my sincere thanks and gratitude to the organizers for inviting me to attend this conference. I have a caveat in the sense that I am a Malaysian, but I work in Singapore, and I have no credibility nor standing to speak on behalf of either of the countries. Essentially, I am stateless. Yeah? So I speak to you as an irresponsible, keen watcher of ASEAN-India relations. Also, on behalf of my colleagues, I would like to congratulate the Ministry of External Relations and the Research Information System for developing countries on this momentous milestone of the 10th anniversary of the Delhi Dialogue, and also for leading the charge to keep ASEAN-India relations on even keel and even to bring it further. So thank you for keeping the faith in this very important bilateral relationship. Mr. Chairman, if I may, I'll quickly divide my short remarks into three categories or three major points. One is a very general overview on how perhaps individually I look at India's Act East policy, and second, how do we do maritime cooperation, and I'll conclude with perhaps some observations of the challenges ahead. First and foremost, ASEAN as a collective looks to India favorably. We hope and we welcome the Act East policy, and we look forward to India playing a much more engaged role. And I think our host has been very humble and very Asian in that sense that I have not heard of our host perhaps suggesting that India is a sea power. And India's notion of being a sea power would change our calculation and how we not just look at India, but the notion of the Indo-Pacific concept or strategy moving ahead. We see India perhaps as the next economic superpower. It is a major power, but its influence is being manifested. But what role does it play as a sea power, not just in the Indian Ocean vicinity, but in the seas all around the world, in particular in the South China Sea, in the Pacific Ocean? I think that would have ramifications and also a major effect on how ASEAN and India respond to each other and to move forward in our relationship. But having said that, I think the Komodo has been in many CSCAP working group and study groups, and I think one of the observations is that India, from the Southeast Asian perspective, could play a larger role, but he has been somewhat laggard somehow compared to the other major countries. So this is where we will roll up the red carpet for India to play a more visible role, and the question is, what kind of role does India would see itself playing in the region, and how can it collaborate with the Southeast Asian states? Which brings me to perhaps the second point. How do we do maritime cooperation? And this is where I may be a bit un-ASEAN in perhaps suggesting that we have noted that not all of the ASEAN states have navies, although Laos, surprisingly, is a deadlocked country, but you have a lot of ships registered under the Laotian flag. Yeah? But the point here is that maritime cooperation and maritime affairs is not an issue that you have round support among all the 10 ASEAN countries. Yeah, and when it comes to working with India, you may not get all 10 ASEAN member states on board to work with India per se. So perhaps a more productive strategy would be to pursue a mini-lateral strategy where you reach out and work with friends and build on in that sense. So do not give up on ASEAN, But to start off with 10 ASEAN countries may be a little bit difficult in that sense. Now you have, India I think has established very good relations with Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia for sure, and increasingly Vietnam as well, and Philippines. I think more and more will actually come on board in that sense. So it should be a snowball effect in that sense to build the momentum, the build in terms of the trust. So do not go for the jugular in sense of taking all the 10 ASEAN countries together. But having said that, I think there is a value in engaging ASEAN at two different levels perhaps. One is that at a discourse level, the ARIF, the expanded East Asia Maritime Forum, ADMM+, I think India and ASEAN discussions with the other dialogue partners, the other major powers and middle powers is very productive, is very important. That is at the strategic, diplomatic discourse level. But at the functional level, at the practical level, there are things that we are doing as ADMM+, we are doing as ARF, but in terms of the mileage that India gets in relating to ASEAN, I will wager that there are more things that we can do directly between ASEAN and India. This is when my idea of perhaps building on the snowball effect on multilateralism that build onto the larger context may be more useful. Perhaps in the next 2-3 minutes, I'll move on to the challenges. We have heard that India has very broad and extensive and in-depth relations with the individual ASEAN member states and a lot of bilateral collaboration. And this is not new. This has been long-standing, and this is actually growing. So I think one challenge is that how do we make this bilateral into trilateral and eventually make it into multilateral, and hopefully at the end of the day, do not leave ASEAN out. Because if we do leave ASEAN out in some ways, then maybe India may be criticized that you're not engaging the region and you're only picking up friends in that sense. So I may be a bit contradicting myself in the sense that advocating multilateralism on one hand, but on the other hand, look at the collective as a whole. So maybe in that sense is how do we find common ways to do things on hard security that may be more palatable to some of the littoral country states that have more at stake and that have more capabilities to engage India in military exercises and so on. But the other things that are less costly, tabletop exercises, military exchanges in terms of education and so on, capacity building that the other 10 countries would happily agree to. There is also a notion of perhaps ASEAN member states doing too many military exercises, not just with India, but with US, with Australia, Japan, and this year with China as well. So there is a fatigue. India is a sea power, it's a major power, but most of us are, even the biggest of us as a middle power, Indonesia, they are pales in comparison to India. So the rest of the militaries, the rest of the navies will have a smaller budget, and there's only that many military exercises that they can do that the budget could actually afford them. So it's not a matter of not wanting to engage India, but we have to be more selective, because if we agree to one, then others would be knocking on our doors. So ASEAN has to be fair, has to be inclusive, so we need to balance in that sense. And third, I think we need to manage some expectations. Rightly so, I think India's main priority and strategic perception is on the Indian Ocean. Right? Unfortunately for us, Southeast Asia, our center of the universe in terms of geographical sphere is more or less still Southeast Asia, where the South China Sea and the seas surrounding it looms large, which includes Indian Ocean, but Indian Ocean is not the main focal point in that sense. So to put it crudely, we may, our centers of universe do not overlap that much. There is overlap, but it's not the primary focus for the two partners. So how do we bridge the Indo and the Pacific, quote unquote, in that sense?
1 minute more.
Sure. And lastly, the recent appointment of Prime Minister Mahathir of Malaysia has shaken Malaysia's foreign policy somewhat, and he has recently made an announcement in reference to the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea that essentially keep the major powers out. The Chinese and the Americans should limit their patrols in these waters, essentially we can take care of ourselves, right? So what ramifications do that have on our maritime cooperation with India? I'm not saying that India has patrols in the South China Sea or the Straits of Malacca, but if India envisions playing a higher maritime role in the region, they will see higher visibility. Perhaps the last point, on a more practical point, is that in terms of maritime cooperation, we can institutionalize the ASEAN relationship, the AHA Center in terms of HADR, right? Perhaps we can link up with the resources with the Indian Navy, the Indian Armed Forces, and also perhaps in terms of the coordinate patrols, we take into consideration of South China Sea. Can we find a way to link up with the Bay of Bengal in that sense? So that will be seamless monitoring of anti-smuggling, transnational crime, and so on. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
Much, Dr. Tang. You know, there's a sense of deja vu when he was making a reference to Prime Minister Mahathir, because 25 years ago, when we were doing CSCAP, you know, we would have our Malaysian rep sharing some of the objectives and the vision that the Prime Minister at that time had for his country and for ASEAN in the maritime domain. So I'm just, you know, saying this, flagging this point, saying that those of you who are part of Delhi Dialogue in 2048 plus, some of our younger scholars, let's check if we have some political leader who would be resurrected 25 years later, but that's the sociological aside of ASEAN. What I will do is I want to thank my panel for this fantastic staying within the time limits that I know very unfairly imposed. We have a few minutes for the question and answer that I was determined to get that. What I will do, if with your permission, is that I would like to recognize our ASEAN participants first, because you have come from afar. If you have something to share, please. And then a couple of media people asked me over a cup of tea saying that will they get a chance? I said, yes, if there's time, I will. So any of our ASEAN participants want to go first, and then I'll come back to my Indian colleagues, time permitting. I can see some hands. Any of our ASEAN participants would like to ask a question, please? No comments, if we can help it. No ASEAN? Yes, sir. Please identify yourself and, you know, and my request is ask a question.
From Thailand. I'm a former diplomat, and foreign ministry cannot own me anymore. What I want to say is I want to support Dr. Tang's point. I think the maritime cooperation, you have to look at two levels. The Indo-Pacific level and the intra-ASEAN-India level, because 20% trade, if we grow, if we expand, that in itself will create a lot of discussion that we need to do. It helped to increase trade, investment, whatever, between India and ASEAN. The intra-maritime cooperation that linked India to Myanmar will increase trade of the overland, mainland ASEAN. Increase in shipping. The building of road and rail on the mainland ASEAN is not because of the shipping thing, because of the internal intra-ASEAN trade that require more roads, more rail. There'll be increasing trade among ASEAN mainland countries. I just want to leave that point. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Is there anyone else, failing which, any ASEAN rep? Or in which case I'll recognize Professor Baladas. He's Professor ASEAN for many of us in India. And then I'll take one more. Baladas, you can go first.
I think in this discussion, there is one point that needs to be kept in mind. The perceptional differences between India and ASEAN. Also, I would highlight cultural differences. We talk about Indian culture and all that, but I think there are differences in which Indians and Southeast Asians approach a particular subject. Indians are direct, Southeast Asians are not. So in any kind of maritime diplomacy with ASEAN countries, I think these 2 points need to be kept in mind. One is there are differences of perception, and that needs to be bridged. And the way you sort of bridge that difference, you have to approach it in a different cultural mode. Thank you.
Yeah, very quickly, thank you. My question would be to any of the speakers from ASEAN. You know, we have spoken about the increased challenges to maritime security, not so much in the Indian Ocean, particularly in South China Sea, because you said that is your universe, West Pacific is your universe. Now we've seen that, you know, there has been another formation, informal formation, not at very senior level, that is Quad, the 4 countries. And they have also been discussing at initial stages as to how to deal with or how to respond to the new challenges. My question to my ASEAN colleagues would be, what would your response be in terms of associating ASEAN countries either individually or in groups, informally or formally, with the Quad deliberations that have been taking place? Thank you.
Thank you very much. From Brunei Darussalam, Mr. Mutalib. I have a question, I think, posed to Admiral Kumar and Dr. Tang and perhaps Siswanto Rushdie. It's a common question where perhaps all of you could address and answer back. But somebody mentioned about the importance of which is definitely true, on the safety and security of maritime routes, etc., and so on. Now, from the perspective of ASEAN, volume is an issue. You know? We don't have the mass, etc., and so on. But when you're looking at, in terms of size, in terms of market, in terms of the distance, my question is, what would you say about the intermodal transport system? Somebody mentioned about this, but in passing, but I'd like to hear from your perspective too, how you can actually gain synergy from a good integrated intermodal transport system. Somebody mentioned about sea linkages and land, but what about air, sea, and land integrated synergies? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. Just prefacing the question, this is the heart of this, the entire dialogue, this session. And I think if scholars don't behave as diplomats, that would be much better. So my question goes really to Dr. Tang. Do you really believe that this whole theme of maritime cooperation, which is related largely to maritime security, relates only to threats of non-traditional nature? Are only a few terrorists and a few pirates and natural disasters the only issue for this whole 11 countries, ASEAN and India? Or are there other traditional threats which I'm afraid I have not really heard much this morning at all? What are your views on this? Thank you.
Thank you. It's actually a response to a question raised earlier about how ASEAN looks at the different proposals of the Quad countries. I think that was a so I think I'd like to quickly reply with the indulgence of our participants. There are 3 important things for ASEAN right now. That any feature or any characterization of Indo-Pacific should be building on ASEAN centrality. The second thing is that it should provide economic opportunities for all. And the third is that ASEAN should not be used as a pawn in the relations, geopolitics and geostrategic relations among the major powers. Thank you.
That's a, I think, very valuable input you've given, Madam. In the interest of time, while this particular session is at the heart of this 2-day conference, Delhi Dialogue, Maritime Security Cooperation, let me just take the liberty of being in the chair and responding to your point. This was raised yesterday also, and I'll try and say this as emphatically and unambiguously as I can. As a student of India-ASEAN for the last 25, 30 years, and I was, as I said, involved as a note taker when Prime Minister Rao had really envisioned this Look East, and MEA, the Ministry of External Affairs, had done some pioneering work. I want to remember one of our former secretaries, Ambassador A.N. Ram, Amarnath Ram, and I also want to very sadly report that he's no more with us. He passed away in March this year. And one of the, madam, this is for your consideration, and our other ASEAN participants here, one of the central political kind of, shall we say, orientations as far as the policy was concerned is the centrality of ASEAN. At that time, ASEAN was 5. And whatever initiative India was embarking upon, there were 2 guiding principles that I can remember. I'd be happy to be corrected at later sessions. One, the centrality, which even Prime Minister Modi reiterated. When he spoke at the commemorative summit, he spoke in Indonesia and in Shangri-La, that whatever India is doing recognizes the centrality of ASEAN. And the second is that it will be consensual. So I just thought I would share this because some of our panelists made these remarks, that if it appears that sometimes India is reticent or India is hesitant, we've heard this very often for the last 20 odd years, India can do more. Why is India not doing more? When push comes to shove, my observation as a student is India rises to the occasion, it comes to the table. December 2004, tsunami is a good example, and the professionals in ASEAN recognize this. But also I think there is a political kind of sensitivity that whatever ASEAN is comfortable with, that is the pace and that is the track that will be pursued. So I thought I would just flag that for your consideration. I'm sorry about this time management. There are a number of questions, number of issues. I'm going to request the panel and maybe ask Ashok, Admiral Kumar, if you could respond to one question, sir. The one about the internodal, the Brunei rep had asked, if you would like to. Or, okay, I'll pass that. And Dr. Tang, if you would like to respond to, the scholar diplomat and what are the security considerations. You have 280 characters. You can make 2 tweets and respond to Rajiv, Admiral Bhatia, Ambassador Bhatia. Sorry.
You're asking a person to respond in a Twitter form when I don't have a Twitter account, so which means I have no limit. Thank you very much, Your Excellencies and the Minister, for the question. I'll take the question on the Quad and also on the elephant in the room. I think Your Excellency is alluding to that. In terms of the Quad, my observation is that it's very difficult for any of the ASEAN member states, and definitely almost impossible for ASEAN as a collective to come out openly to talk about anything about the Quad. It will be an individual country perspective. You may hear, perhaps, I hope I will not be quoted, and I will not be quoted for the press on this. Perhaps we hear from our some scholars that maybe one particular country may be more in favor of the Quad. But what does being in favor of the Quad mean? Does it mean that this country is joining a military alliance or supporting it? We are not sure. But what is a Quad? I put this question, and I'm not being a diplomat here because I'm not. It's very interesting that the Honorable Prime Minister of India, in delivering the Shangri-La dialogue, I think he did an excellent job in telling us what his vision about the Indo-Pacific is about. I think no other leader has given that vision. I think the principle he laid out is very clear. But it's very interesting that in that speech, in that seminal speech, he made no mention about the Quad. And it's also very interesting that although the Indo-Pacific was supposed to be in perhaps response to India, and after coming back from Singapore from the speech, there was very high signal visits and diplomatic initiatives with China. So for us, looking in terms of South China Sea, here you are, have these 4 countries telling us that it is time to push back against China. It is time for us to stand up against China. That was some of the message that was communicated to us. And what is ASEAN doing? We have to stand up as well. But then we are seeing very mixed signals. In fact, Secretary Mattis at the same Shangri-La dialogue clearly told our Philippine colleague in response to a question on the Scarborough Show. Effectively, from what I heard is, in not so blunt language, you're on your own. US refused to give an unequivocal guarantee that America would affirm its security treaty commitments to a long-standing ally in that sense. So if we are South Asia looking at these Quad countries, who do we trust? Who can we trust? In a sense that when it comes, push comes to shove, would the Americans show up? In this Twitter age, we are not very sure. Twitter would definitely show up, but will the 7th Fleet show up? Will the American commitment show up? I think there's a big question mark on that. Yeah. Yeah. And I think the last question is, I focus a lot more on the non-traditional security, because these are indeed not just the low-hanging fruits, these are the entire basket of fruits that we are talking about in terms of the ASEAN-India or ASEAN-China or ASEAN-EU relationship in that sense. I don't think ASEAN at this point is ready for hardcore security commitment. Indeed, this is not what ASEAN is not a security or military organization or alliance in that sense. We will do things that affirm our security, because we are being pressed in many ways, right? Give you one example. When the US approached the ASEAN defense minister for an informal dialogue, right? And that was agreed to. The other major powers, namely China, will say, what about us? And eventually we have to do with everyone else in that sense. I'm sorry, it's not a very satisfactory answer. That it may seem that we are playing the game somehow, but I will put to you, isn't India playing the same game? Isn't America playing the same game? Even EU playing the same game? Isn't Germany playing the same game when the Audis, when the Mercedes is on the line? Thank you.
Sorry, I'm sorry to cut you on that, but I think it's a very important point that Dr. Tong has raised, and you gave a good answer actually. I think the complexity of the current strategic situation is what you are drawing attention to. And let me again share this anecdotally, because I've been around for a fairly long time as a student of this subject. I'm like Rip Van Winkle. But in the 90s, when we used to meet under the CSCAP banner, and we had the first 5, and let me also remember the late Mr. Nathan, former Prime Minister of Singapore, who very often used to lead the delegation from Singapore, and he was a kind of political heat sink when he used to deal with these issues. We had other members, we had the Chinese on board, we had the Americans, the Australians, and so on. I'm saying this again for sociological interest, that in the first session when we used to meet, my basket, maritime, we'd have the Chinese rep, we'd have the Taiwanese rep. And as per diplomatic protocol, the Chinese rep would protest and say, we cannot have this meeting because of Taiwan. And then there'd be a confab. Many of us were smokers. We'd go out, have a cigarette or a cigar with coffee, and come back, reconvene, and say that there is a UN, World Health Organization protocol wherein Taiwan can sit. So we'd reconvene and say that this is the format, and we are going to look at issues that would broadly be seen as in keeping with WHO's broader charter, and the meeting would go on. So China, and the anxiety that China generates and the anxiety that China brings to the table has been part of the subtext of ASEAN's own deliberations, of the major powers whenever they have met under whichever banner, track 1.5, track 2, and so on. So I just thought I'd say that even yesterday, when we spoke about the security of the Indo-Pacific, it is being challenged at many levels. And I said this in the morning, I'm saying it again. For purposes of understanding and simplicity, you can see the security of the region, the Indo-Pacific, the wider continuum, from the east coast of Africa all the way up to the Western Pacific. There is a strategic and security dimension where the major stakeholders are the major players, the major powers. There is the United States, there is China, there is India, there is Japan. All of them have a stake in the orientation of the maritime domain. When our minister, Sushma Swaraj ji, spoke yesterday, she was drawing attention about the normative and the most desirable strategic orientation would be a certain commitment to a rule-based order. But we also said this yesterday in one of the sessions, who makes the rules? Who interprets the rules? And what is the compliance with a rule that is interpreted in a certain way? We saw how China reacted to the tribunal award in relation to the artificial installations. I think even to call them islands would be a misnomer. The moment you accept the semantic of island, you accord certain privileges which are not there. It's an artificial installation. So there is a huge dimension at the security and strategic level, and everyone is hedging. Tang is right. Every power is hedging in terms of when and where do you draw the line. My reading of Minister Swaraj's speech yesterday at the Delhi dialogue was to say that India has been consistent. Shankari made this point. For the last 25 years from Prime Minister Rao to now, the rules-based, shall we say, suggestion has been made. And what I think the current dispensation under Prime Minister Modi is signaling is that where we have concerns, they will be flagged. Where we need to resist, and I'm extrapolating, this has not been said, I am extrapolating, saying the subtext is, where there is a need to draw a line, it will be drawn. How it will be done, perhaps this is not the best forum. I'm sure that our diplomats and political representatives are engaging with this in their own manner. So I'll leave it at that to say that there are many security challenges, security and strategic, economic trade, sea lines, Hu Jintao's Malacca dilemma, all of them come under the trade, economic, energy basket again. And finally, the geophysical, the health of the ocean, immigrants coming by sea, piracy, criminality, gun running, flesh trade. All of this, by the way, was addressed 25 years ago when we spoke about the incidence of criminality and how criminality was eroding the integrity of maritime agencies, coastal police, revenue agencies, and what that was doing to the collective. Every ASEAN country, all 10, have their own experiences to share about the loss of integrity in terms of dealing with these issues. They're all real challenges. But I'll leave it at that, and as I close this session, Prabir, I'm sorry we've overshot. Before I thank the panel, let me thank the audience. I think you've been terrific in complying with the requests about telephones and not speaking while the session is on. I want to thank the panel, I think, for fantastic time management. I apologize for nudging. And allow me also to commend the RIS and the Ministry of External Affairs, because I do come for these Delhi dialogues and other deliberations, and I think there seems to be some kind of traction in terms of identifying the policy kind of issues. And I close with the last note that I've said in the past, that, we as a group, when we meet, we come from different disciplines. Some are in government, some are outside government, some have been in government, and so on. I think the challenge remains the same, whichever sector you pick up. Whether it is the music of the Bay of Bengal or ASEAN, or it is hardcore strategic security or HADR and so on and so forth, I think the challenge is to find the least discordant issues. Tang spoke about low-hanging fruit. There are low-hanging fruit. They have to be politically filtered by each country and its ruling dispensation, governing dispensation. So I think the challenge is to find the least discordant and then accord them the highest collective effort. Whether you're an academic or a naval officer or a coast guard or a politician or a diplomat, and see which of these, because we need to pursue multiple tracks. We do not have the luxury of picking one item or one strand and saying we'll do only this. So on that note, thank you everyone, and let me hand the session back to Prabir.